At our family's Christmas feast, my grandmother passed out checks for $5 million, and the only person who didn't laugh was the bank manager who called me the next day. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 29 years old. And last Christmas, my father looked at me with pure contempt and called me a fool for holding on to a gift from his mother. The gift was a check for $5 million. He ripped his to pieces. My mother tore hers in half. My sister tossed hers into the fireplace and recorded it burning for her social media. My brother wadded his up and threw it under the table like trash. I was the only one who slipped mine into my coat pocket and said, "Thank you, Grandma," the following morning. A bank manager led me into a private office, locked the door behind us, and whispered a sentence that is still seared into my memory. My relatives spent the rest of that year attempting to reclaim what they had scorned, and their efforts to get it back exposed a side of my family I never knew existed. Before we dive in, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I genuinely read each one. Now, let me set the scene. Christmas Eve, at the final dinner my grandmother ever hosted. My grandmother never locked her front door. Not once in nearly 50 years. And that December, the house carried the same familiar scents it had when I was a little girl visiting for the first time. Oak smoke curling from the fireplace, fresh banana bread cooling on the counter, and something faintly sharp underneath. Something I couldn't identify until much later. I arrived in my beat-up sedan with a bag of apples from the tree I'd planted behind my rental cottage. And she greeted me at the door in that buttery yellow cardigan and the same apron she'd worn since her hip first started giving her trouble. She pressed a kiss to my forehead the way she always had, one hand cradling my jaw as if she were confirming I was still the same girl she remembered. "Tell me about your class," she said. She asked it every single Saturday. She always genuinely wanted to know. We settled at her old wooden table with mismatched teacups, and I told her about Marcus, a quiet fourth grader who refused to participate in group discussions but could write stories that made my heart ache. She listened with complete attention. She asked what Marcus needed most. I said patience, and she replied, "Then give him all the Saturdays you can." I mentioned a vintage bed frame I'd found at a flea market, missing a drawer, and she chuckled into her tea, joking that it was probably haunted by a farmer who would disapprove of my taste in literature. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the cup down. I pretended not to notice. We spent some time knitting together. She was working on a small gray project she kept hidden from me. I was struggling to finish a scarf I'd started back in October. Through the window, her usual cardinal visitor appeared at the feeder, snatched a single seed, and flew off as he always did. She watched him as if he were an old friend she was expecting. As I left, she pressed a thick envelope into my hand on the porch. Inside were 2 crisp $10 bills for gas money. She gave me that same envelope every month, and I never cashed one. I kept them all in a shoebox under my bed because what she was truly giving me wasn't money for fuel. I didn't realize it then, but that was my third to last Saturday afternoon with her. I drove down the hill humming a tune. My mother never called just to ask how I was. She called to update me on her own life and to see what I had, often hoping to get some of it. She caught me on my drive home, about 10 miles out of town, with my turn signal clicking like a metronome in the quiet car. "Eleanor, honey, are you visiting the old woman again?" That's what my mother called her own mother-in-law. Never Grandma, never Sylvia, always the old woman. "I go every Saturday, Mom. She's fine, sweetheart," my mother said with a sigh that made me feel unreasonable. "She has her pension and her pride." I could hear my older brother Grant in the background, chewing loudly. Eleanor, I need a ride to the garage on Monday. My truck's broken down again. I have class Monday, Grant, so come in the afternoon then. My sister Hollis texted me while I was still on the phone. She lived an hour away in a bigger city with a husband she showed off online, but rarely mentioned in person. Hey babe, can you spot me 200 until next week? Promise, I'll pay you back. 3 emojis followed. My mother kept talking over the silence, planning Christmas dinner. Your father wants roast beef. Make sure she doesn't cook for hours this year, Eleanor. She gets so tired and then just sits there staring at us. No one asked if my grandmother was feeling well. No one asked if her hip pain was worse. No one asked why her hand was shaking. I realized I was waiting quietly, hoping someone would. I made a quiet decision on that snow-covered road that I didn't fully understand until much later. I'll see you Christmas Eve, I said. And Eleanor, my mother's tone shifted into her familiar advice-giving register. Don't let her convince you to move in with her. She's proud, but she'll take advantage of your soft heart. I ended the call. My father hadn't spoken a word on the line, but I could feel his presence anyway, like a background hum you grow up with. He'd been warning me for years not to let his mother trick me. He used words like trick. I had never once witnessed my grandmother try to trick anyone. The first promise my grandmother asked me to make wasn't about saving her life. It was about keeping her secret. She told me on a Saturday in late October in her garden while we were trimming rosemary for the winter. The light was that low, golden kind you only see in a garden that's been tended by the same hands for 40 years. She set down her shears and sat on the bench, sinking into it more heavily than usual. You remember Dr. Priya? She asked. Of course. I saw her on Tuesday. I waited. I'd learned that my grandmother revealed things at her own rhythm, and rushing her was as pointless as trying to rush a tomato plant. Pancreatic, she said. Stage 4. I've known since July. The bench seemed to tilt beneath me. I didn't cry, which surprised me. I think some part of me had known for months, the way you know a season is ending before the first leaf turns. Chemo? I asked. She shook her head. No, I want to spend what time I have here in this garden at my kitchen table, not in a hospital room. Eleanor, I'm 82 years old. I've lived a long and fascinating life. She took my hand, her fingers cool but steady. I'm not sad, I'm just sorting things out. She plucked a sprig of rosemary and pressed it into my palm. I can still smell it. I have one request, she said. Don't tell them. I want Christmas to be Christmas. I don't want it to be a vigil. I don't want your father writing my obituary at the dinner table. I want roast chicken and terrible wine. I want one more year of pretending he's the man I raised. A glint appeared in her eye, the one that meant she was about to say something profound. Besides, she added, I have a few things I want to give out first. It's going to be a very interesting Christmas. I didn't sleep that night. 5 days later was Thanksgiving. A month after that was Christmas, and nothing she ever said was an accident. Every member of my family walked into my grandmother's house that Christmas Eve with a hidden agenda disguised as affection. My father arrived first, stomping snow off his boots like he was claiming the territory. Richard Vance had the kind of posture he'd maintained for 30 years at the machine parts plant, and in 3 months, it wouldn't be enough to keep him employed. He hung his coat on the best hook and opened the refrigerator without asking. My mother entered behind him, already dispensing compliments. Oh, the tree is just darling this year. I watched her eyes scan the ornaments. The silver star my grandfather had crafted in 1974, and I could see her mentally cataloging. Grant brought his latest girlfriend, who looked 18 but wasn't, and he barely acknowledged our grandmother. He did, however, greet me. "Still teaching those kids, huh? When are you going to get a real job?" He grinned as if it were a joke. It wasn't a joke, but it wasn't wholly mean either, which somehow made it worse. Hollis arrived last, phone already raised, recording a video for her followers. "Cozy grandma vibes, my loves. You have to see this fireplace." She didn't hug our grandmother. She air-kissed near her cheek and returned to framing her shots. My grandmother moved slowly from the stove to the table in her yellow cardigan. She didn't say much. She simply watched her family with the calm, observant expression she'd worn for 30 years of gatherings. It was the look of a woman who had long since stopped being surprised. She caught my eye once and smiled, as if she were sharing a joke with someone who hadn't arrived yet. Margaret Darrow, my grandmother's best friend since 1974, who owned the used bookstore on Elm Street, stopped by with a jar of honey and stayed for 10 minutes. Before she left, she touched my arm in the hallway. "You're the only one she ever talks about," Margaret said. "I hope you know that." Bing Crosby played on the kitchen radio, skipping the way it had since 1997. No one ever fixed it. No one ever bothered. The turkey fat sizzled in the pan, and my grandmother placed a small wooden box beside her chair, setting it where no one would notice. That night, my grandmother handed out 5 identical envelopes. By the time the roast was cold, 4 of them had been destroyed right in front of her. She waited until everyone had eaten. She stood up slowly, one hand on the back of her chair, and cleared her throat in that precise way she always did before speaking. My family kept chatting, as usual. "I have something I'd like to give each of you," she said. Grant rolled his eyes at Hollis, who rolled hers back. My grandmother opened the wooden box and withdrew 5 cream-colored envelopes. She walked around the table, placing one beside each person. Mine was last. She touched my shoulder as she set it down. My father opened his first, because he always opened everything first. I watched his expression shift from curiosity to confusion to something tight and angry. Inside was a check from First National Hollow Ridge, written in my grandmother's slanted blue ink, for $5 million. Grant laughed before he'd even read his. He leaned over, saw the number, and laughed harder. "Grandma, is this a joke? Are we playing Monopoly?" Hollis giggled, holding hers up to the light like a costume prop. My mother's face did something strange for a moment, as if she'd been handed a kindness she didn't know how to accept. Then, my father said, loud and flat, "It's fake. Don't be an idiot." He dropped his check onto his plate. Gravy soaked into the corner. My mother tore hers in half slowly and placed the pieces beside her wine glass. "Mother, really? This isn't funny." Grant crumpled his into a ball and flicked it under the table. Hollis stood up, walked to the fireplace, and dropped hers into the flames. The paper caught at the corner, and I watched the number 5 with 6 zeros curl and blacken and disappear. My grandmother didn't blink, she looked only at me. I took mine, folded it once, and placed it in the inner pocket of my purse. "Thank you, Grandma," I said. She nodded once. No one else noticed. I drove home that night gripping the steering wheel like a church pew during a funeral hymn, because otherwise my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Snow fell heavily, and my wipers kept an uneven rhythm, a lopsided beat I'd learned to find comforting over 4 winters. I counted it as I drove, the way Marcus, my student, counted his fingers when he felt overwhelmed. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. My grandmother had watched 4 of her grandchildren and her own son mock her to her face without flinching. She'd only looked at me. She wasn't senile. She was the sharpest person I'd ever known. She read the Sunday paper cover to cover, making marginal notes. She beat me at bridge every other week and bought herself chocolate on the weeks she lost. She'd once caught an error on my federal tax return from memory, and 2 weeks before Christmas in the garden, she'd asked me an odd question that had seemed harmless at the time. If you had $1 million, Eleanor, what would you do first? I'd laughed. I don't know. Buy new supplies for my class, probably. We're out of dry erase markers. She'd nodded as if I'd given the right answer on a test. At home, I placed the check on my kitchen table and examined it under the yellow overhead light. The paper had a heavy weight. The security weave, when tilted, shifted like oil on water. The routing number matched First National Hollow Ridge, the bank I walked past every day. The signature was my grandmother's, the same one on every birthday card I'd ever received. I turned it over. On the back, in her steady blue ink, she'd written, "For the one who still comes on Saturdays." I sat down on the kitchen floor and stayed there for a long time. The check lay on the table above me. Outside, the snow muffled everything. In the morning, I would go to the bank. Not to cash it, just to ask. The manager at First National Hollow Ridge had known me since I was 16. His name was Benedict Strom. He had a mustache he'd kept since before they were fashionable again, and a small plastic horse on his desk that I'd always assumed belonged to a child who had grown up. He smiled when I walked in. He wasn't smiling a minute later. "Mr. Strom, I'm sorry to bother you the day after Christmas." I pulled out the check. "I just wanted to verify this. My grandmother gave it to me last night, and I didn't." I slid the paper across his desk. He looked at it. His smile faltered. Something flickered behind his eyes, and he picked up the check with both hands. His face went pale. "Eleanor," he said, using the tone a doctor might use. "Can you come with me for a moment?" He stood and walked ahead of me, past the tellers, past the Christmas wreath on the vault, and opened the door to a small private room with no windows. He held the door, shut it, and turned the latch. "Have a seat." "Is it real?" He sat across from me, folded his hands, and looked at the check, then at me. "Eleanor, have you read what she wrote on the back?" "Yes," he took a breath. "Your grandmother came in the first week of November. She moved funds into a special account. She had 5 of these checks drafted. I was the one who prepared them. They are as real as this desk." I counted backward from 10, the way I told Marcus to. I looked at the little plastic horse on his desk. "Ma'am," Benedict said, his voice turning professional, "this is real. All of it is real." He paused. "And this is only part of it. There's a lawyer named Halverson who will be contacting you. I'm not supposed to say more than that." I walked out of the bank with $5 million in my account and a feeling that this was not going to be the thing that changed my life. My grandmother had been a millionaire longer than I'd been alive, and the only person in our family who had ever thought to ask about her finances was the teller who cashed her Social Security checks. I drove straight to her house, still in my winter coat, carrying the smell of photocopier paper and old coffee. She was in the kitchen. The coffee was on. She wasn't surprised to see me. She had never been surprised to see me. "You went to the bank?" "Yes." "Was Benedict nice to you?" "He was terrified." She smiled into her chipped cardinal teacup. She pushed a second cup across the table for me. "Sit, sweetheart." I sat. Your grandfather left me $400,000 in 1998, she said, plus this house and the garden. I didn't know what to do with it. I was 55. I'd been a music teacher for 30 years. I'd never bought a stock in my life. She paused. So I went to the library. I read everything I could. I wrote letters to a man in Chicago who had a column in a magazine I liked. His name was Mr. Smith, he wrote back. We corresponded for 17 years. I never met him. He died in 2015. He left me 40% of his firm. Grandma, I have roughly $40 million. Give or take a market day. I set my coffee down. The cardinal on the cup watched me with one chipped eye. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? Because nobody ever asked, she said without bitterness. Your father asked me once, in 2003, if I needed him to manage my money. I said no. He never asked again. He didn't ask because he wanted to help. He asked because he wanted control. I'm not obligated to hand my life over to someone who confuses those two things. She reached across and squeezed my hand. I didn't give them money last night. Eleanor, I gave them a last chance to ask me why. And they didn't ask. It took exactly 112 minutes for my family to stop calling that check fake and start calling it theirs. Benedict had to make a compliance call. He contacted my father because my father was on an old shared account from 20 years ago. He didn't give details. He simply said a wire had posted. That was enough. The first call came while I was still in my grandmother's kitchen. Then another. My phone, face down on the table, buzzed 32 times in 45 minutes. I counted because I couldn't think of anything else to do. Hollis's texts flooded in. I need my check. I changed my mind. It was an accident. Eleanor, baby, can we talk? I have to pay my storage unit. You don't need that much. Be fair. Grant's voicemail was louder. You give that back. That's family money. You little weasel. You hear me? My mother cried on her voicemail, a soft, practiced cry with a hiccup at the end. Eleanor, sweetheart, you don't understand what you're doing to this family. I've been so patient. I've never asked you for anything. I looked at my grandmother. She was calm, eating a piece of toast, watching me with the mild attention of someone observing a storm she had predicted. I'm going to turn this off, I said. Good. The knocking started 40 minutes later. My father. I saw his truck pull up through the kitchen window. He marched up the walkway at that specific speed he used when he was being reasonable out loud, but furious underneath. My grandmother stood up slowly and walked to the front door. She didn't open it. She stood at the glass. My father pounded on the door and tried the handle. Mom, open the door. Richard, she said through the glass, it's the 26th of December. It's not a good time. You gave her $5 million. I gave each of you $5 million. 4 of you burned yours. Mom, Richard, go home. She didn't raise her voice. I'll see you when I see you. She turned the lock for the first time in 47 years. My father stood on the porch for a long moment. Then he left. My grandmother came back to the table, picked up her toast, and said, well, that's begun. The week my grandmother broke her hip was the week I stopped pretending I could keep her forever. It happened in the yard on a Tuesday in mid-January. She went out to scatter seed for her cardinal, slipped on ice she couldn't see through the snow, and lay there for 40 minutes before I happened to drive past, noticed her front door standing half open, and stopped. The hospital wanted to admit her. She wanted hospice at home. Hospice, at home, is what she got. She'd already written the paperwork 3 months earlier, and Halverson had notarized it. I requested a leave of absence from Briar Hollow Elementary. The principal, a quiet woman named Mrs. Osgood, looked at me across her desk and said, "Take whatever time you need, Eleanor. Come back when you come back." I moved into my grandmother's spare bedroom, the one with pressed flowers on the wall and a handmade quilt. I set up a baby monitor on her nightstand. Theo, the gym teacher, who was a good man and nothing more, drove my things over and didn't ask any intrusive questions. My father visited once, stayed 20 minutes, and told my grandmother she should let Grant take her home. She said, "Richard, I am home." He didn't come back. Each night I read to her. She loved Willa Cather, especially My Antonia, which had been a wedding gift from her mother. I read slowly. She closed her eyes. Sometimes she corrected my pronunciation of a prairie town name. Sometimes she slept. The honey lemon water on her nightstand froze at the edges overnight because the radiator was old and the walls were paper thin. Every morning when I changed it, I noticed my hand was smaller than hers had ever been. We had both shrunk that winter. On a Thursday near the end, she asked me to open the top drawer of her dresser. Inside was a brass key on a leather loop. She placed it in my palm. "When Halverson calls you," she said, "give this to him. He'll know what it opens." "Grandma, not yet. Eleanor, soon, and that's all right." My grandmother died the way she had lived, on her own terms, without fuss, in a room that smelled like old books and wool. It was February 3rd, a Tuesday, at 5:47 in the morning. I know because I looked at the small travel clock on her nightstand, a clock her husband had given her for their honeymoon in 1962. It kept bad time, and she'd never replaced it. She'd been quiet for 2 days. The morning before, she'd squeezed my hand and said, "Eleanor, I am so proud of you." She hadn't spoken since. I was dozing in the chair when the furnace clicked off. The house got very quiet. I knew she was gone. Her hand was still in mine, still warm. I didn't cry right away. I sat for a while, listening to the morning. The radiator knocked once. The cardinal came to the feeder, took one seed, and flew away. Then I called Margaret. She was there within the hour. She sat beside the bed and held my grandmother's other hand, the same hand she'd been holding since 1974. I called my father next. He picked up on the 4th ring. I told him. He was quiet for a moment, then his voice cracked. For a second, I thought he was human after all. Then my mother came on the line, and her first words were, "When's the funeral going to be, Eleanor?" "I have an appointment on the 10th. I hung up. The funeral was that Saturday. My grandmother had left written instructions. She wanted her yellow cardigan. She wanted to be buried beside her husband in the small cemetery behind the Lutheran church she'd never actually attended. She wanted no eulogy from Richard. She wanted me to read a poem. They all came. They cried loudly. My father wore a black suit that didn't fit. My mother clung to his arm. Hollis filmed the procession from behind her sunglasses and later posted it with a soft filter. The caption read, "Healing. I filmed nothing." I didn't cry until that night. Let me pause here for a moment. If you've stuck with me this far, if you've ever lost someone who loved you more than you thought you deserved, leave their name in the comments. I'll read every one. I'm asking because what comes next is hard to tell, and knowing you're with me makes it easier. Stay with me. My father called the lawyer before the gravediggers had even finished their coffee. Halverson told me later that my father had left 3 voicemails by noon on the day of the funeral, all asking when the will would be read. Grant came to my house the next evening, walked in without knocking, sat on my couch in his funeral suit, and asked bluntly, "Do you know who she left the house to?" "No, Grant. I didn't ask." "You were there every week. She must have said something." "We talked about my students, her garden, bridge. I don't know what's in her will, and I don't care." He looked at me for a long time, trying to read me. Grant has never been good at reading people. He took a beer from my fridge without asking and left. Halverson called me the following Monday. He was as I remembered him, tall, slow-moving, with a voice like a cello. "Miss Vance, your grandmother retained me for many years. There will be a reading of her will at my office on February 20th, 10 in the morning. All immediate family are named. I'd like you to be there." "All right, Mr. Halverson. There is a safe deposit box here in my office. I'll ask you at the reading if you have the key." "I have it." "Good. Can I ask you a question?" "You may." "Did she tell you what's in the will?" He was quiet for a long moment. "She did." "Will it surprise anyone?" He laughed once, dryly. "Miss Vance, it will surprise every single person in that room except you and me. And even you, I think, a little." The day of the will reading was a Friday. I wore a gray dress. I drove into town with an assumption that was entirely wrong. My father used the exact same words when he heard the will that he'd used when he tore up the check. "Is this a joke?" Then he said it again, louder, as if the room hadn't heard. Halverson's conference room had a wood-paneled clock on the wall that ticked loudly. My father sat on one side of the table. My mother sat beside him, hand on his sleeve. Grant sat across. Hollis sat at the end, scrolling until Halverson asked her to put her phone away. Margaret sat beside me. I'd asked her to come. My grandmother had asked her to come. Halverson opened a dark green folder, put on his reading glasses, and began. "This is the last will and testament of Sylvia Marigold Vance, dated April 14th, 2022, witnessed by Margaret Darrow and Dr. Priya Okafor, notarized in my presence." He read the preamble and the list of specific bequests: the cardinal teacup to me, the bridge set to Margaret, the soldered star to the church, the piano to the elementary school. My father's jaw tightened. "The principal remainder of the estate," Halverson continued, "comprising the family residence at 114 Linen Hollow Road, the surrounding 23 acres, all investment accounts, and all remaining personal effects, valued at approximately $40 million net of the 5 gifts already distributed. The testator leaves the entirety of this remainder to her granddaughter, Eleanor Rosemary Vance." No one spoke. The clock ticked. My father's face didn't change for 3 full seconds. Then he stood up. "Is this a joke?" "Mr. Vance, please sit down." "Is this a joke?" "It is not a joke. It is a legal document. Please sit down." My mother made a small sound like a teacup set down too hard. Grant stared at me. Hollis pulled her phone back out. Halverson read the attached reason clause. "I leave this to my granddaughter Eleanor. She is the only one who visited me on Saturdays. She came for no reason other than love. She cared for me at the end of my life. She never once asked what I had." My father sat down and stared at the table. Margaret took my hand under the table. I held on tight. The lawsuit arrived in the mail 4 days after the will was read, and I knew before I opened it which of them had filed it first. The complaint was filed on behalf of Richard Vance, Linda Vance, Grant Vance, and Hollis Vance Briggs. The cause of action was undue influence. They claimed I had manipulated an elderly, ailing woman into leaving me her entire estate. I sat on the floor of my kitchen and laughed a laugh that wasn't happy. I called Halverson. He'd been expecting it. "I'll represent you, Miss Vance, free of charge. I owe your grandmother 3 decades of trust. Let me finish what she started." I called Theo next. He was in his driveway scraping ice off his car. "Should I try to settle? Just give them something?" He was quiet for a second. "Eleanor, you didn't do anything wrong. Your grandma knew exactly what she was doing. Giving in would be the only way to disrespect her." Okay. That was the whole call. That's the kind of friend Theo is. My father sent an email the next morning, subject line family meeting. It read, "Eleanor, we need to sit down. This has gone too far." I forwarded it to Halverson, who replied on my behalf, politely referring all communication to his office. Hollis began posting veiled videos, sitting in her car, talking about a family betrayal she couldn't discuss for legal reasons. Her followers rallied. "Stay strong. Queen. Family is everything." "I'm so sorry, babe, I watched 2 of them. I didn't watch the 3rd. My grandmother had been in the ground for 18 days. The case wouldn't be heard until October. Probate moved slowly. Contested probate moved slower. I would have to live for 7 months with my family's lawsuit against me. I went back to work on Monday. Marcus was happy to see me. The safe my grandmother had given me the key to didn't contain stocks or deeds. It contained proof that she'd been paying attention. Halverson drove out to the house with me on a Saturday in May. The lilacs were beginning to bloom. He walked through the rooms with the quiet respect of a man who had known the woman who'd lived in them. The safe was in the back of her bedroom closet, behind a row of cardigans. He watched as I turned the brass key. Inside were 3 things. First, a thick legal folder containing the will, the notarizations, and 3 capacity evaluations Dr. Okafor had performed over the years. Everyone clean, dated, and signed. Halverson smiled a grim smile. Your grandmother understood litigation. Second, a bundle of letters. Every birthday card I'd ever sent her, starting with a crayon drawing from when I was 4. She'd kept them all and labeled them by year in small pencil on the backs. Third, a leather album, green, soft-cornered, bound with a shoelace she'd replaced at least once. I opened it on the floor of her bedroom. It was a journal. On each page in her slanted hand was a single entry, a date, a few words, sometimes a pressed leaf or a feather or a ticket stub. February 5th, 2015, Eleanor came. We read about the Nebraska prairie. She cried at the part with the plow. October 22nd, 2016, Eleanor came, brought apples, helped with the gutter. August 19th, 2018, Eleanor came tired from her first week of teaching. We both napped. Every Saturday I'd come, going back a decade. 487 entries. I counted them later. On page 112, there was a tea stain. Her note underneath read, "Eleanor brought pie." I spilled my tea. Much laughter. I cried for the first time since the funeral, into my own sleeve on her bedroom floor while Halverson stood in the hallway, kindly pretending to look at the view. I wasn't alone in the courtroom. She had counted every Saturday. The judge who ruled on my grandmother's will had gone to high school with her in 1962. She mentioned it twice before the hearing. Her name was Judge Bernadette Ames, and she recused herself from cases where the relationship was closer than passing acquaintance. She and my grandmother had been classmates in a graduating class of 51. That was acquaintance. She could hear the case. She announced it in open court, and my family's lawyer didn't object because he knew he had nothing better to wait for. Halverson was calm. He walked the judge through the will, the medical evaluations, and the witness affidavit. Dr. Priya Okafor took the stand in a navy suit and spoke with the precision of a woman who'd testified before. She had evaluated my grandmother 3 times, once in 2022 at the will signing, once in 2023 as a follow-up, once in 2024 because my grandmother had insisted. All 3 concluded full testamentary capacity. The third was performed 11 weeks before her death. Margaret took the stand next, wearing her reading glasses and a small silver pin Sylvia had given her for her 50th birthday. Your Honor, Sylvia Vance and I played bridge every Wednesday for 40 years. In her last week, she remembered the hand I misplayed in September of 1987. She still teased me about it. Margaret looked at my father when she said the next part. She was not influenced by anyone. She was the most unpersuadable person I have ever known. Then the family lawyer cross-examined me. I'd been dreading it. I'd rehearsed. I didn't need to have rehearsed. Miss Vance, did you ever suggest to your grandmother how she should allocate her estate? No. Did you discuss her finances with her? No, I didn't know she had any. Did you ever encourage her to favor you? No, sir. Then why, in your opinion, did she leave you everything? I hadn't been prepared for that question. I thought for a moment, looked at Margaret, and said, I came because it was Saturday, Your Honor. That was the whole reason. The judge wrote something on her pad. She looked up. The court finds the will valid as executed. The contest is dismissed. Plaintiffs to bear defendants' reasonable attorney's fees. Halverson squeezed my shoulder once. I didn't look at my father. My father called me his worst daughter in front of a local journalist, and by Tuesday, the Hollow Ridge Chronicle had printed the phrase in a pull quote. It happened in the marble hallway outside courtroom 3. I was walking with Halverson toward the stairs. My father emerged from the restroom, saw me, and something he'd been holding for 9 months let go. You are the worst daughter I have ever had, Eleanor, his voice echoed off the marble. 3 people turned, including a young woman with a notepad and a press badge from the Chronicle. She didn't look away. She made a deliberate note. I kept walking. Halverson steered me gently past. Grant followed. Don't you feel guilty? He said behind me, not quite shouting. Not even a little? I stopped and turned. Grant had been my older brother for 34 years. He'd pushed me into a pool when I was 6. He'd helped me move 3 times. He'd borrowed money and never returned it. He'd come for Thanksgiving without calling. He'd stood at my grandmother's coffin with dry eyes. No, Grant, not even a little. Hollis had been live streaming from inside the courtroom. The bailiff had asked her to put the phone away twice. She'd ignored him. Her video was pulled by the platform within an hour for violating broadcast policies. She lost, according to a comment she made later, 7,000 followers in a single afternoon. She'd crossed the line from grieving cousin to embarrassing spectacle. I drove home that afternoon and sat in the cold kitchen drinking tea. Theo brought dinner he didn't pretend to have cooked. We ate in silence. The Chronicle piece ran on Tuesday morning. The headline was measured. Probate court upholds contested will in Vance estate. The body was factual, but there was a pull quote with my father's words verbatim and a small detail in the closing paragraph. Mr. Vance was laid off from his position at a regional parts manufacturer earlier this year. The manufacturer announced closure in March. It wasn't vindictive. It was a reporter doing her job. But it ran in a town that read every word. A small town has a long memory, especially for people who burn money in front of the dying. My mother's spa had a grand opening banner that had been there for 2 years, faded pink, hanging slightly off the awning. It started losing clients in the 3rd week of November. Not all at once. A Tuesday regular stopped booking. A Friday regular. The woman who owned the flower shop across the street, who'd been friendly with my grandmother in the choir, walked past the spa for weeks without looking in. My mother called me in December and cried, asking if I could help. I said no, gently, and she hung up. Grant's construction office, the one he'd been running out of a rented corner of a warehouse, was repossessed in late January. He'd been 3 months behind on rent. The landlord, who'd gone to school with my father, had been patient. The local paper ran the filing in the back section. People read the back section. My father didn't find another job. He applied at 3 places. He didn't get a single call back. He was 58, had spent 30 years at one manufacturer, and was in a job market that had declared his species extinct. My mother moved back in with her sister in Ohio in November. My father stayed in the house I'd grown up in. He didn't invite anyone over. Then there was Hollis. The Chronicle story was picked up briefly by a regional blog, which led to a comment thread, which led to a woman in Akron contacting Hollis's husband Marcus about credit card balances that seemed inconsistent with his household income. Marcus, who'd been suspecting something for a year, checked. He found $80,000 of debt Hollis had been hiding. He filed for divorce in April. Hollis moved in with my mother in Ohio by the end of May. She'd lost about 12,000 followers and any leverage she'd imagined she had with our father. Theo and I were at his kitchen table when I read Margaret's text about the divorce. Theo looked at me. I looked at him. "You didn't do this," he said. "I know." We sat with it anyway. The thing about my grandmother that no one in our family ever bothered to learn was that she had been quietly feeding her children's school for 40 years. I found out on a warm Saturday in May, going through her desk. I decided not to sell the house. I couldn't. I told Margaret, who had been running her bookstore out of a cramped storefront on Elm, that she could use the front 2 rooms for a second location. She'd cried, agreed, and brought over boxes. We were clearing drawers together when I found the notebook. It was small, soft leather, bound with an old brown shoelace. It slipped out from behind the drawer liner in the bottom right of her desk, the kind of hiding place you use when you don't want to be caught being kind. I opened it. Every page was a year. Each year had a line: 1985, Milk Program, 840, 1986, Milk 900, Textbooks 1200, 1987, Milk 950, Library $400. It went on for 40 years. The last entry was November 2025, Milk Books new set of drums for the music classroom. The running total at the bottom, in her steady hand, was $284,600. Briar Hollow Elementary. My school. The school where Marcus, my 4th grader who wouldn't speak in group work, drank a small carton of milk at every lunch because it was part of a nutrition program fully funded each year by a private anonymous donor no one had ever met. I sat down on the floor of her kitchen and put the notebook in my lap. I didn't move for an hour. A pressed leaf fell out of the back cover. An oak leaf. She'd written under it, "Benji's first day, October 1984. I asked Margaret later who Benji was. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "Your father. He was a kindergartner." My grandmother had begun feeding the school the year her son started there. She'd fed it straight through his childhood, his adolescence, his graduation, his marriage, his children, his grandchildren. She'd fed the school that fed us. She never told a single one of us, including the one who spent her own days teaching inside it, that she'd kept us all in dry erase markers for a decade without our knowing. My mother sat at my kitchen table in February and looked, for the first time in my life, like someone who wasn't performing. She'd come without calling, taken a bus from Ohio, walked the last mile through slush in a coat that had been expensive 6 years ago but was now just a coat. She knocked twice. Softly, I let her in. I made tea. I didn't say much. She'd lost weight, not the way she used to diet, which was loud and announced. She'd lost weight the way grief loses weight for you. Her hands shook on the cup. She pulled out a letter, the one Mr. Halverson had given her after the reading. She hadn't opened it until last month. She said she remembered a specific Tuesday in 1994, before I was born. She'd come over and been short with her mother-in-law. She'd understood, even then. Her own mother-in-law had been difficult with her. She didn't want to pass that down. And the letter said, "I forgive you, Linda. I have forgiven you for 30 years." My mother put her head on her arms on my kitchen table. I let her cry. I didn't pat her shoulder. I didn't say it was okay. I just made another pot of tea. When she looked up, her makeup was gone, and her face looked like it had before I was born. I was looking at a version of my mother I'd never met. "Eleanor, I would never ask, but the spa needs 100,000 to stay open. I could save it. I'd pay you back. I would." I looked at her. I didn't feel angry, just a kind of tired tenderness. "Mom, I'm not giving you money." She nodded. She'd expected that. "But I'm going to set up a fund in her name for college. For any grandchild I have someday, and for any child in Hollow Ridge who needs it. That's what I'll do with her money." That's what she would have wanted. She nodded again. She stood, hugged me small for 1 second, and left. "I'm not angry anymore, Mom," I said at the door. "I just don't know you." She didn't turn around, but she nodded. I gave notice at Briar Hollow Elementary on a Tuesday, and by Friday I'd rented a small cottage in a town in Maine I'd never set foot in. Mrs. Osgood didn't try to talk me out of it. She'd known me for 4 years, watched me come back from leave, watched me go through a trial, watched me keep teaching a class of 9-year-olds as if the ground weren't shifting under my feet every morning. She accepted my resignation with a small dry nod and said, "You will be a good teacher wherever you go, Eleanor. You already are." I set up the foundation with Halverson, $20 million, the Sylvia Vance Scholarship Fund. It would cover tuition, books, and milk for any student who needed it from elementary to college in Hollow Ridge County. Halverson wept quietly in his office when I signed the papers, the only time I ever saw him weep. He'd loved her. I'd always known. I didn't sell the house. I couldn't. I deeded the right to use it to Margaret for her lifetime for the bookstore. She named the new branch Sylvia's Second Reading. She painted the sign herself. I applied for a 4th-grade position at an elementary school in Newberry Cove, Maine, a town I'd picked from a road atlas because the name sounded like something my grandmother would have liked. I didn't visit first. I did a phone interview. They offered me the job 2 days later for $51,200 a year, which was the salary I'd always had and the salary I intended to keep having. My father called once in June. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message asking if we could meet, just the two of us, for coffee. He said he had things he wanted to say. I listened to the voicemail 3 times. Then I wrote him a single email. "Dad, I'm not going to stop loving the person you should have been. But I can't keep writing that letter for you. Take care of yourself. Eleanor." I didn't send any of the versions where I tried to explain further. I couldn't lie to him. I packed what fit in my car. It fit in my car. The first cup of coffee I drank in Maine was the worst cup of coffee I'd ever had. I laughed out loud in the parking lot. I'd driven 2 days through New Hampshire and into Maine. The Subaru coughed in fourth gear, a sound I'd been ignoring for 3 years. I had the yellow cardigan in the front seat beside me, folded, because I couldn't bear to pack it in a box. I stopped at a roadside gas station south of Augusta. They had coffee in a pot that looked like it had been there since the Carter administration. I bought a cup. It was objectively a disgrace. I stood in the parking lot and laughed. A real laugh, the kind I hadn't made in a year. I startled a man putting air in his tire. I got to Newberry Cove in the late afternoon. The town was small, the way small towns are small. One main street, a post office, 2 diners, a feed store that had become a yarn store, a bakery closed on Tuesdays. The cottage I'd rented sat on a bluff a half-mile out, gray clapboard, weathered porch with 2 rocking chairs, one missing a spindle. The landlord had left the key under the flower pot as promised. I unlocked the door and stood in the hall. The cottage smelled of cedar and the sea. It was empty and quiet. The kitchen had a cast iron stove I didn't know how to use yet. The living room had one window facing the Atlantic and an uneven floor that creaked when I crossed it. I carried the yellow cardigan into the living room and draped it on the arm of the one chair that was already there, a green wingback left by the last tenant. The sleeve hung over the arm the way it used to hang over my grandmother's kitchen chair. I stood and looked at it for a long time. In the mailbox that evening was a single envelope, Margaret's handwriting. Inside was a card and a brief letter. Eleanor, Sylvia knew you'd end up somewhere like this. She told me 10 years ago. She said, Eleanor is a coastal soul. It just hasn't told her yet. Welcome home, Margaret. By the next June, I had a 4th grade classroom that faced the Atlantic and a yellow cat who believed my grandmother's cardigan belonged to him. The classroom was on the 2nd floor of Newberry Cove Elementary, a brick building from 1936, with floors that squeaked in 8 specific places, all of which my students learned to skip on the way to the pencil sharpener. My class had 18 students. One of them was a quiet girl named Rosie who didn't speak in group work. I gave her patience. I gave her Saturdays in the form of extra 20-minute conversations after school on Tuesdays. She started to raise her hand by May. The first awards of the Sylvia Vance Scholarship Fund went out in April. 47 students. I read every application. 2 of them were children from the Briar Hollow Milk Program my grandmother had been paying for since before they were born. I cried quietly over both files. I signed both approvals. Margaret drove up in early June with a mason jar of jam from the garden. She stayed 3 days. She sat on my porch and read a paperback and didn't talk more than was required. She was 80 years old. She looked on my porch like a woman who had decided to live to 100 out of spite. My father sent me a birthday card on July 14th. It was the first birthday card he'd sent me in 10 years. The card was generic, "Happy birthday, daughter." On the inside, in his cramped handwriting, he'd written 4 words, "I hope you're well." I didn't write back. I didn't tear it up either. I put it in a kitchen drawer. I don't know why. I think I will someday. The cat arrived in late June, skinny and yellow with a torn ear and a skeptical way of looking at a person. He walked in through the screen door I hadn't properly latched, jumped onto the yellow cardigan on the wingback chair, and went to sleep. I didn't have the heart to move him. I named him Cather. He slept on the cardigan every night. Every morning, I had to ask his permission to borrow it. He would look at me with a single half-open yellow eye, as if he'd inherited the memory directly and was only tolerating my use of it on loan. On a Saturday in August, I sat on a porch that belonged to me and wrote a letter that didn't need to be mailed. The sun was setting over the bay. It was setting 10 minutes later than it had set behind my grandmother's hill. I'd been keeping track for some reason. I sat through all 10 minutes that night, the way you sit through the credits of a film you don't want to end. The letter was to her. I told her about the classroom, about Rosie, about the 8 squeaky floorboards, about the day the principal brought donuts, about Cather and the cardigan and the way he looked at me. I told her I'd figured something out. I hadn't won because I had money. I had money now, and most of it wasn't mine and never would be. I'd won because I knew how to sit still with someone who was leaving. Because I came on Saturdays for no reason. Because I put the check in my purse instead of the fire. Because when she'd asked me in her garden what I would do with $1 million, I said I'd buy dry erase markers for my class. And she looked at me the way a person looks at an answer they've been waiting their whole life to hear. I folded the letter and put it in the small wooden box she'd kept by her chair on Christmas Eve, the one I'd brought to Maine. I closed the lid. I stood up. Cather, through the open window, looked at me with the patient disdain of a creature ready for dinner. "Coming," I said. I went inside. If this story has reached you, if somewhere in your life there's been someone who loved you more than you knew how to receive, please tell me in the comments. Tell me their name and what they taught you about quiet kindness. I read every one and I carry them with me. If you'd like to hear another story about boundaries, inheritance, and the women who choose to walk instead of stay, the next one is waiting for you in the description. It begins with another check. Come with me.